How to get lost in China. Have you ever gotten lost in China, or do you know someone who got lost in China? Either way, you're in for a treat with this week's episode of China University Podcast. We're talking about what happens when you get lost in China. Have you ever found yourself lost in a maze of streets, unable to communicate with the locals, and feeling overwhelmed by the language barrier? Or maybe you've taken a wrong turn on a hike and found yourself in an unfamiliar territory with no idea how to get back home. Getting lost in China can be a daunting experience, but it can also be an opportunity to learn Chinese, explore new places, and develop some survival skills, especially if you're a student. This is a very special episode, not only because of the stories I'll share, but because for the first time, I invited someone to share his story in the podcast. So keep listening if you want to hear some of the craziest ways me and some friends got lost in China. Welcome to China University. This is Chimsy, your student advisor. In this podcast, I will not only talk about the many professional, academic, and personal growth opportunities this country has to offer, but also I'll mention some of the major obstacles foreign students encounter while living in China. I'll share my experience, thoughts, and opinions along with some realistic advice and genuine encouragement. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this episode to help this podcast become more relevant and reach more people. You can listen to full episodes on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcast, in where you can find me as China University Student Advisor. You can also follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as China University Podcast, and on Twitter as China Uni Podcast. Welcome to China University Podcast. We will explore the joys and challenges of studying in China. I'm your host, Chimsy, and today we'll be discussing the topic of getting lost in China, as well as sharing stories and advice from our listeners. While getting lost can be challenging, it can also be an incredible opportunity for growth and adventure. When you're lost, you're forced to think on your feet, problem solve, and communicate with the locals. These can help you build confidence, resilience, and cross-cultural communication skills. In fact, some of the best memories and experiences come from unexpected adventures, I can assure you, such as discovering a hidden gem of a restaurant or stumbling upon a local festival. So don't be afraid to get lost and embrace the journey. It's important to embrace the experience and make the most out of it. You never know what you might discover or who you might meet. So take a deep breath, explore, and enjoy the journey. Remember, being an international student in China is an incredible opportunity to learn and grow, both academically and personally. So don't let the fear of getting lost hold you back from experiencing all this amazing country has to offer. So, alright, let's start with my story. At first I was not sure if I wanted to share this story here in the podcast, but I'm pretty sure you guys will laugh. On my second day in China, I decided to go to a club with some foreigners I had just met, and without even being drunk, man, and like the typical Lao Wai suffering from China's immortality syndrome, I decided to get onto the stage and dance there. When I tried to get back down, I lost my balance and landed on a table full of glass cups. I tried to play it cool and acted as if it was intentional, but people clearly knew it wasn't. I kept dancing and tried to process what had just happened, and I think as I tapped my hand on my lap, or as I tried to reach for my phone, I realized that my pants were covered in blood. Like, not a lot, but there were blood stains. I looked at my middle finger and saw it bleeding. Oh god. Luckily, a contremate saw my pulsating finger and took a band-aid out of her purse, almost as if she knew something like this was bound to happen that night. And after a while, I went to the bathroom to try to clean my literally bloody pants, but when I came out, the place was so crowded that I lost track of the people I had come with. The fake-free alcohol had already taken its toll, and I found myself seeing double for the first time. Jeez, man, like, I always thought seeing double was just a caricature or a joke about drinking alcohol. I went out to take a taxi back home, but then I opened my wallet and realized that I only had US dollars and my debit card. Obviously, none of the taxi drivers would accept my green money, and on top of that, my Chinese proficiency was 0. I didn't even know how to ask for an ATM, but I did know how to say my address in Chinese. I kept on walking for like an hour, begging taxi drivers to take me home and accept my dollars. But then I saw this Lao Wai in the street, He gave me the La Wai look, that look foreigners used to acknowledge each other's presence in China. Then he asked me if I was lost, and I told him that I needed an ATM to withdraw some money and go back home. He said there were none nearby, but he opened his wallet and gave me 20 yuan, man. This guy, I swear, he'll go to La Wai heaven for sure. Thank you so much, random stranger. Anyway, I finally made it back home, and I remember walking into the building's lobby and sitting down on the couch. I remember being thirsty AF, so I saw a vending machine, and after paying the driver, I had some change left. So I remember there were only two options: rice porridge or jujube yogurt. I pressed the button for yogurt and got a can of rice porridge. I honestly didn't care. I didn't have any more coins, so I just drank the entire porridge. I took the elevator and turned on the AC and landed on my bed. And when I was reflecting on my second day in China, I touched my pockets and realized I had lost not my cell phone, not my wallet, but my freaking passport, man. I stood up and sobered it up in 2 seconds. I searched my room. I couldn't find it. Who the hell carries their passport to a club? But geez, man, I don't know. Maybe I'm stupid or something. I rushed back outside trying to see whether I dropped it in the street. I concluded that I had probably dropped it in the taxi. I was playing it cool, trying not to freak out in front of the security guards, who were super confused, by the way. They were like, was this like why with this bloody finger and bloody pants roaming around? Man, like deep inside I was panicking, I have to admit. So then I walked back home and I sat down on the same couch I sat at first, and I remember rubbing my face in desperation. I stared blankly at the vending machine and I couldn't believe my luck, man. My passport was right there, just lying on the table next to the vending machine. I picked it up and felt, man, I don't know how to describe it, a wave of relief washing over me, man. But anyway, little did I know that this was just the beginning of my many misadventures of getting lost in China. It took me almost a month to realize, for some reason, that Google Maps has a margin of error of about 400 or 500 meters in China. And even though it wasn't supposed to work in China 7 years ago, it did work. But all the locations on the map were displaced by around 400 or 500 meters. After struggling to reach any destination for like a month, I finally figured it out. Google Maps was faulty. So for any newbies out there, avoid using Google Maps in China and instead use Baidu Maps or Gaodo-D2 or any other Chinese maps. Most of the times I got lost in China were due to lack of information or technological difficulties. Do you remember how in episode number 3, being broke in China, I had a crappy phone that would refuse to turn on if the weather was too cold? I had to heat it up by either rubbing it against my belly or by hovering the screen over the flame of a lighter. That piece of garbage. So you can imagine how easily it can be to get lost in China if you're not fully equipped with at least a backup phone, power banks, and reliable data. Also, it's pretty easy to get lost if you're not familiarized with Chinese apps such as Baidu Maps, Didi, or Ctrip. When it comes to lack of information in China, I think that there are two main factors to consider. Firstly, not speaking Chinese or being unfamiliar with the Chinese street names of your vicinity or the name of your destination or home address can cause significant problems, I'm telling you. Secondly, not knowing bus and metro schedules or hotel and taxi availability can also lead to difficulties. I think that it's so important to note that not all Chinese hotels accept foreigners. And look, this is not a matter of racism. Don't pull that card here. But rather the result of not all hotels having the necessary registration system in place. It's worth keeping this in mind when booking accommodation, especially as it can take some time to find a hotel that can accept foreigners. I think Ctrip has this very useful feature. For example, it allows you to filter hotels based on their ability to accept foreign guests by selecting the option 外宾使用, which translates to for foreign guests to use. But yeah, look, most of the stories I've heard from foreigners getting lost in China begin with them not being able to communicate or them missing the last bus or missing a train or going to the wrong address. So today I have a very special guest who will be sharing his expertise on getting lost in China. I am extremely excited because this is the first time I have ever had a guest on my podcast. Some of you may be wondering why I haven't had any guests before, and I have a good reason for that, I swear. The thing is that some friends and listeners often invite themselves to my podcast, which is very flattering, seriously. But it can be a bit awkward when I have to decline and explain that this is a solo podcast. The main reason being that I cannot afford to let guests talk for hours as they want and then spend hours editing the audio file. As I mentioned before, each episode takes a significant amount of time and effort to produce. And to give you an idea, the post-production process alone takes 10 minutes for every minute of the episode. So for example, the Distractions in China episode, which is 22 minutes long, required about 3.5 hours of post-production work, not including the hour it took to record and the 1 or 2 hours of research. So, it involves removing all the background heavy reading and disgusting noises that come from our mouths, throats, and lips, which we humans emit without paying any attention to them, but professional microphones can catch and amplify. But without further ado, let's listen to my beloved friend Daniel from Mexico and his incredible story.
Thanks, Chimsy, for inviting me. My story goes like this. Some weeks ago, I bought a bicycle from a friend. The bike was in Shanghai, and I live in Hangzhou. In my mind, it sounded completely reasonable for me to ride the bike all the way from city to city. I just had to sit for some hours, listen to nice music, and sooner or later I will be back home. I went to Shanghai on a Friday, the perfect timing for visiting my friends and having some drinks. I woke up the next day with a fancy hangover. I started my happy trip at 11 a.m. When I reached the border of Shanghai and Zhejiang, my cell phone decided to jump out of my pocket and smash the pavement. Fragments of the screen were completely gone, and I could not manipulate it whatsoever. This means no GPS. There I was, in the middle of the road, hours away from any city, only with my bike, my jacket, and my broken cell phone. Fortunately, I always carry some cash, and even if my cell phone screen was broken, I still had music running on the background. I decided to continue the way to Hangzhou. I guided myself with the signs on the road. From time to time, I stopped at gas stations to ask for directions. It was hilarious. Imagine a guy on a bike in the middle of nowhere coming to you and ask you, "Where is Hangzhou?" That's basically what I did.
Not any guy, by the way, a foreigner a la white. That fact by itself probably made it 10 times even more bizarre for any Chinese person he ran into along the way.
I will not lie to you. It was a heavy trip, and it tested my patience as going without a map resulted in a longer route. I got completely lost when I reached the city of Jiaxing, which is in the middle of Shanghai and Hangzhou. It was around 9 p.m. when I arrived there. There are fewer signs marking the road to Hangzhou and also fewer pedestrians to ask for directions, especially when I reached the industrial area. Most of the people told me, "It's too late, it's too far, 100 kilometers, or it is too dangerous to go bye-bye." Eventually, I found the way out of Jiaxing and I found the highway G320, which leads to Hangzhou. Back on the road, I encountered that one of the exits to Hangzhou was blocked. At that point, I just wanted to reach home and get into my bed, so I jumped the fence. Later, I realized that the reason why it was closed was because the road was still under construction.
Man, I totally lost it. I swear to God. I totally lost the way he said that the reason why the way was blocked was because the street was still under construction.
It was dark, the path was rough and narrow, and the traffic was made by huge trucks carrying rocks around. It was so scary. I survived anyway. This trip took me to the verge of collapse. I arrived my home at 4 a.m. in the morning of the next day. The adventure took me roughly around 17 hours. My advice is that if you ever get lost in China, don't be shy to ask strangers to lend you their cell phones. So that's it. Back to you, Chimsy.
Wow, thank you so much. That was such a funny story. I'm sure I would have found my way back home too, but probably only after crying like a baby for half of the trip. And I'm happy that you were able to listen to this story directly from the person who experienced it. Let me know in the comments if you like this kind of dynamic and where I dedicate a segment of the episode to foreigners who want to share their own stories and opinions. We have reached the part of this podcast in where I give you some realistic advice and genuine encouragement. Getting lost in China as a foreigner can be a frustrating experience, but I'm telling you, it can also be a great opportunity to explore the city and discover new places that you might not have found otherwise. And to avoid getting lost, it's always a good idea to have a map or navigation app on your phone. As I mentioned earlier, it is important to use Chinese navigation apps like Baidu Maps, Gaodu Maps, and apart from that, learning some basic Chinese phrases and characters can be incredibly helpful when it comes to directions or reading signs. And you gotta remember to have a backup phone, power banks, and enough data. These three things will be crucial for you to find your way back home whenever you get lost. Also, don't forget to carry a little bit of cash. I always put a 100 yuan bill between my phone case and my phone just in case I need it. Now, if you find yourself lost, don't panic. You gotta take a deep breath and try to assess your surroundings. Look at landmarks, street signs, or anything else that might help you get your bearings. Like Daniel put it, don't be afraid to ask for help either. I dare to say that most of the Chinese people you run into in the streets are friendly and more than willing to assist foreigners. You gotta remember that getting lost is all part of the China experience, and it's something that happens to everyone at some point. If you haven't gotten lost in China yet, try to embrace the adventure and enjoy the journey. Even if it doesn't go exactly as planned, just let your friends know where you're going and where you're going to be at. And finally, don't forget to laugh at yourself and the situations you find yourself in while living in China. Like I said before, it's all part of the China experience. Plus, it will make for great stories to share with friends and family back home. I always like to finish my episodes with a famous quote, and today's quote is by the American author Rover II, and it says, "It's okay to get lost once in a while. Sometimes getting lost is how we find ourselves." Let me repeat that. It's okay to get lost once in a while. Sometimes getting lost is how we find ourselves. What did you discover about yourself after getting lost in China? Let me know in the comments. Alright, that's it for today. In the next episode, I'll talk about skipping classes in China because let's be honest, we've all done it or have been tempted to do it at some point. But why do we do it? And what are the consequences? Stay tuned to find out. But before I let you go, don't forget to like, comment, and share this episode to help this podcast become more relevant and reach more people. You can listen to full episodes on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, where you can find me as China University Student Advisor. You can also follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as China University Podcast, and on Twitter as China Uni Podcast. Thank you for listening to China University Podcast. See you next time.